Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of History's Greatest Battles. As always, if you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share this podcast with them. You know, each civilization views its collective history through a rosy-colored rearview mirror, as it would be. Today's battle, the fall of Granada from Moorish Muslim hands into Ferdinand and Queen Isabella's Christian hands, the same Ferdinand and Isabella that funded Columbus's expedition that took him to the Americas, through perhaps overly simplified Western eyes, is viewed as a beautiful step in the rung to the modern world we enjoy today. I want to contrast that view with a quote about the fall of Moorish-ruled Spain from historian Stanley Lane-Poole. Quote, "For nearly 8 centuries under the Mohammedan rule, Spain set all Europe a shining example of a civilized and enlightened state. Her fertile provinces, rendered doubly prolific by the industrious engineering skill of the conquerors, bore fruit 100-fold. Art, literature, and science prospered as they then prospered nowhere else in Europe. Mathematics, astronomy, botany, history, philosophy, and jurisprudence were to be mastered in Spain and Spain alone. Whatever makes a kingdom great and prosperous, whatever tends to refinement and civilization, was found in Muslim Spain. With Granada fell all Spain's greatness. For a brief while, indeed, the reflection of the Moorish splendor cast a borrowed light upon the history of the land which it had once warmed with its sunny radiance. The great epic of Isabella, Charles V, and Philip II, of Columbus, Cortez, and Pizarro, shed a last halo about the dying monuments of a mighty state. When followed the abomination of dissolution, the rule of Inquisition, and the blackness of darkness in which Spain has been plunged ever since. In the land where science was once supreme, the Spanish doctors became noted for nothing but their ignorance and incapacity. The arts of Toledo and Almeria faded into insignificance. The land deprived of skillful irrigation of the Moors grew impoverished and neglected. The richest and most fertile valleys languished and were deserted, and most of the populous cities which had filled every district in Andalusia fell into ruinous decay, and beggars, friars, and bandits took the place of scholars, merchants, and knights. So low fell Spain when she had driven away the Moors. Such is the melancholy contrast offered by her history." End quote. With that view in mind, let's now experience the Battle of Granada.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 71, The Battle of Granada, June through December of 1491. Castilian forces, unknown. Moorish forces, also unknown. Ferdinand's victorious siege of Granada shattered the last stronghold of Moorish power in Spain, silencing a struggle that had raged for nearly 700 relentless years. An age-old clash of faiths, empires, and warriors had finally reached its thunderous end, sealing Spain's fate and forever altering the course of history.
For centuries, the Iberian Peninsula has been more than a mere swath of land. It's been a forge, hammering out warriors of legendary tenacity. Iberian mercenaries packed the Carthaginian ranks, lending muscle to its might. But when Rome crushed Carthage in the aftermath of the Second Punic War, the victorious Romans took not only the land, but also the fierce Iberian men of war into their legions. Roman rule held the reins over what would become Spain, shaping it with the language, the laws, and the iron of the empire until the 4th century AD, when the rampaging Vandals stormed through, toppling Roman power and then marching southward to ravage North Africa. In the Vandals' wake came the Visigoths, a hardened people who had trekked through cold northern lands and across Europe, finally planting their banners also in Iberia. With each clash and incursion, warrior blood ran thicker in Iberia, but as years passed, even this warrior kingdom softened, and in the early 8th century, the Visigoths would bow to a new force, the relentless power of Islam. In the late 7th century, Muslim armies surged westward from Arabia, carrying both the banner of faith and the edge of steel, sweeping through Syria, across North Africa, and finally in 711, crossing the narrow Straits of Gibraltar into Spain. In a swift campaign, they conquered the entire peninsula, cementing their rule over Iberia. With Spain secured, the Muslim forces looked north, poised to sweep deeper into Europe. But in 732, at the Battle of Tours, they met their match. Frankish forces, under the command of Charles Martel, the future grandfather to Charlemagne himself, struck a fierce blow, halting the Islamic advance and establishing the Pyrenees as the border dividing Christian Europe from Islamic Spain. The Battle of Tours marked a line in the sand. The Pyrenees is the frontier between the realms of Islam and Christendom. But this was no quiet boundary. Tension simmered on both sides, as if destiny itself had decreed these two worlds could never live in peace. The Muslim conquerors dispersed across Spain, claiming their share of its bounty. Arab warriors staked their claims in the rich soils of Andalusia and Aragon. Syrian forces rooted themselves in the south, in Granada. Berbers from North Africa took the Central Highlands, and bands of hardened mercenaries seized whatever land was left to them. But not all of Spain was subdued. In the northern reaches along the Bay of Biscay, a handful of defiant Christian strongholds clung fiercely to their independence. Between these Christian enclaves and the Moors, a fragile truce eventually took hold, a wary calm between old foes. When the once mighty Caliphate of Cordoba fractured and fell in the 10th century, the Muslim provinces splintered, torn by rivalries. Without a unified power, their leaders couldn't mount a single cohesive force against the Christian North. Outside of the rare Holy War, when North African zealots like the Almohads or the Almoravids descended upon Spain, the Moors themselves began to turn inward, growing less inclined to war. Meanwhile, as the fires of the Crusades kindled in the Christian world in the late 11th century, a new battle fever took root among Iberian Christians. Inspired by victories at home, the church rallied its knights not only against Iberian Moors, but across the Holy Land itself. In Spain, the Christians seized the initiative, charging into battle under men like the indomitable Rodrigo de Vivar, known forever as El Cid, the chieftain, and the resolute King Alfonso VIII of Castile. Driven by ambition, faith, or a fierce blend of both, Christian warlords began carving up Moorish-held lands, seizing them piece by piece. By the close of the 15th century, only Granada, the final redoubt in the south, remained under Muslim rule. Granada, capital of the last Muslim province, now lay in the crosshairs of King Ferdinand II. With the recent unification of Aragon, Castile, and Leon under his crown, Ferdinand set his sights on the final bastion, determined to complete the Christian reconquest of Spain. Ferdinand and his queen, Isabella of Castile, were an alliance of iron and devotion. Together they vowed to unify Spain under one faith, a Catholic Spain, undivided and unyielding. This campaign, the struggle for unity and faith, was called the Reconquista, or the Reconquest. In the summer of 1491, Ferdinand and Isabella led their army to the gates of Granada itself, the city crowned by the Alhambra's grandeur. This was the beginning of the siege, the last stand of Muslim rule in Spain. Across from them, the Moors had their own king, Muhammad XI, born Abu Abdullah, but to the Spanish he was simply Boabdil, the last king of Granada. Boabdil's father, Abu Hassan, had once agreed to pay tribute to Ferdinand, buying peace at a price. But in 1478, Abu Hassan broke his pledge, and while Ferdinand's attention was diverted by war with Portugal, the Moors of Granada prepared for the coming battle anew. With those 3 precious years, Abu Hassan summoned troops and allies from North Africa. By 1481, he was prepared, his forces rallied, his will hardened, ready for war. It was Abu Hassan who struck first, launching a brutal assault on Zahara in late December. But Ferdinand's commander, the fierce Marquis of Cadiz, answered swiftly, storming and capturing the fortress at Alhama, barely a stone's throw from Granada itself. The Marquis of Cadiz held fast against Abu Hassan's counterattack, forcing the Moors into a retreat. With this defeat, Abu Hassan lost his throne, overthrown by his own son, Boabdil, who claimed Granada's crown as his father withdrew with loyalists to Malaga. Thus, the Moors were split into two bitterly divided factions, bound by little more than their shared dread of Christian conquest. Boabdil's forces were led by his formidable father-in-law, Ibrahim Ali Attar, a seasoned warrior of 90 years. Through 1482, Ibrahim fought Ferdinand with all his skill until he fell in battle at Sierra de Rute. Without Ibrahim, Boabdil was captured, forced into Ferdinand's hands. Ferdinand released Boabdil, but not without the cost. The Moorish king agreed to pay tribute and hand over hostages, including his own son. A fragile 2-year truce followed, but within the Moorish ranks, hostility toward Boabdil only grew. Meanwhile, Abu Hassan refused to yield as his son had, continuing the struggle against the Christians. But when illness overcame him, his brother, Muhammad ibn Sa'ad, known as Al-Zagal, took up the fight in his place. Al-Zagal rallied the Moorish faithful, pressing on with fierce resolve. Ferdinand countered by unleashing a brutal campaign of talas, a scorched earth strategy that left his fields barren and his villages emptied, starving Al-Zagal of the resources needed to sustain the war. By 1485, Ferdinand's relentless drive had split the province of Granada clean in two, isolating Moorish strongholds and inching ever closer to final victory. Hoping to drive a wedge further between his enemies, Ferdinand sent Boabdil to wrest Granada from his uncle Al-Zagal. But instead of a power struggle, the two Moorish leaders joined forces, uniting against their common Christian foe. Ferdinand turned his might upon Loxa, striking at Boabdil, his former pawn, and sparking a brutal clash followed by a relentless siege. When Loxa fell under fierce bombardment, Boabdil found himself once more in Ferdinand's custody. The war ground on against Al-Zagal, while Boabdil was soon restored to his throne in Granada, only to face the tightening grip of Christian forces around his city. By 1489, Ferdinand's relentless campaign had wrested nearly all the remaining Moorish strongholds from Muslim control. Al-Zagal surrendered, leaving Boabdil alone to seek terms. He reached out to Ferdinand, hoping for a lasting peace between Moor and Christian. But in the summer of 1490, Boabdil abruptly broke off negotiations and launched a final, desperate offensive. Ferdinand's response was swift and decisive. He brought his forces to Granada, prepared to lay siege to the heart of Moorish power. Granada rose from two hills, one crowned by the majestic Alhambra, the other by the imposing Alcazaba fortress. Between them, the Darro River cut a small valley, with the city spread across the heights, a fortress within a fortress, defiant and proud. Encircling Granada, high walls crowned with 1,000 towers stood watch, a barrier formidable even by the standards of the day. Ferdinand's troops spread out in a tightening ring around the city as he set up his headquarters in the nearby village of Atka, poised to command his final assault. For a time, the siege lay quiet, neither side fully committing to open battle. But in July of 1491, tempers snapped, and a clash sparked by taunts and barbed words. During one skirmish, a Moorish soldier hurled his spear toward Ferdinand's royal pavilion, a brazen challenge no Spanish knight could ignore. That very night, Spanish soldiers crept into the city, leaving a copy of the Ave Maria prayer on a mosque door, a message that Christian fervor had come to reclaim what they believed was theirs. By dawn, the Moorish warrior who had cast the spear, known as Yarfe, galloped before the Spanish lines, parading the Ave Maria prayer mockingly tied to his horse's tail, a defiant insult that echoed across the battlefield. Queen Isabella herself had come to observe the siege that day, flanked by a grand escort of cavalry and heavy infantry, led by the indomitable Marquis of Cadiz, Don Rodrigo Ponce de Leon. Her presence was a reminder that this war was fought with not only steel, but the very weight of royal purpose. The Moors opened their gates and assembled in force, preparing for battle, Yet Isabella forbade her forces from attacking. She had come to witness Granada's walls firsthand, not to incite bloodshed. But when Yarfe flaunted his desecration of the Ave Maria, a Spanish knight demanded the chance to challenge him in single combat. Ferdinand, understanding the power of such a duel, granted his warrior's wish. The two knights clashed, armored and unyielding, first on horseback and then on foot, each testing the mettle of the other until the Spanish knight at last stood victorious over Yarfe. In chivalric tradition, neither side had interfered as their champions fought. But as Yarfe fell, the Moors erupted in anger, launching a full assault. The Marquis of Cadiz could no longer honor Isabella's wish for restraint. The Moorish onslaught demanded a response. Spanish troops surged forward. Artillery thundered from the fortress, and the air shook with cannon fire. But the Spanish heavy cavalry cut through the assault, driving the Moors back to their walls, leaving over 2,000 of their dead strewn across the field. Yet victory came at a heavy cost. That night, a single candle in Queen Isabella's tent ignited the curtains, sparking a blaze that swept through the Spanish camp, reducing it to smoldering ruins by the morning. At dawn, Ferdinand marched his soldiers in defiant ranks before the city walls, a show of resilience to remind the Moors of Spanish resolve. Boabdil took the challenge, sending his warriors out to clash in fierce skirmishes that raged along the walls. Yet one by one, the Moors were beaten back, driven once more behind the gates of Granada. Over the next 3 months, the Moors peered down from their fortress, watching as the Christian army transformed their camp into a fortified town named Santa Fe. All the while, the defenders of Granada were cut off, their provisions dwindling as they felt the relentless squeeze of this siege. By September, Boabdil, warned by starvation and the strain of unending siege, called for negotiations. Ferdinand presented him with the capitulations, a remarkably fair list of terms. The Moors of Granada would face no reprisals. Their right to worship would be preserved. Their magistrates would remain locally elected, and their Islamic heritage was assured protection. For those unwilling to live under Christian rule, safe passage was granted to North Africa, with Ferdinand's government even offering to cover the cost of the journey. This agreement was signed on November 25th, 1491, though it would not take effect until 2 months later. Yet when a faction within Granada rose in opposition to surrender, Boabdil requested that the handover be advanced, seeking to avoid further bloodshed. And so on January 1st, 1492, Boabdil surrendered the keys of Granada directly into Ferdinand's hand. The great struggle for Spain was now over. With Granada's fall, the Reconquista came to a close, ending nearly 800 years of blood and conflict. Spain now stood at the dawn of a new era, one that would echo far beyond its borders. Ferdinand's unification of Spain's kingdoms under a single crown marked the birth of a true Spanish nation. With 1492, a fierce national spirit began to rise, stoking the fires of ambition within Spain's borders. Yet with this nationalism came a darker impulse, intolerance for what was not Spanish. The promises Ferdinand had made to Boabdil and the Moors were swiftly disregarded, and Spain's Catholic zeal was given full rein. Thus began the fervent Catholic drive that Spain would become infamous for, a crusade that saw Moors and Jews alike face exile, persecution, and death. The expulsion of non-Christians may well have strengthened Spain's cultural identity and consolidated its people under a single, unyielding faith. Spain's rising nationalism was almost perfectly timed. Strategically positioned between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, Spain was ideally placed to seize control of burgeoning trade routes on both fronts. Nearby, Portugal had begun charting new routes to bypass overland trade controlled by Arab and Turkish middlemen, pushing its expeditions southward along the African coast. Then came an extraordinary opportunity. Christopher Columbus, seeking ships to open a western route to the Far East, came knocking at Spain's door, his appeal landing at precisely the right moment in history. The allure of profits was undeniable. The prospect of bypassing Muslim merchants, irresistible. But it was the religious fervor that also drew Ferdinand and Isabella's attention. Europe had long heard tales of Christian realms in the distant east, and if these far-off allies could be recruited, a new campaign might crush Islam from both sides, reclaiming the Holy Land in a bold sweep for Christendom. The combined promise of wealth and religious conquest was too great for Ferdinand and Isabella to resist. Where a divided Spain would have been mired in conflict, a united Spain was free to rise to this challenge. In the end, Spain triumphed, establishing an empire of staggering wealth and influence across Europe. Yet that empire came at a steep cost. In the Western Hemisphere, it brought devastation, eradicating entire native civilizations. The conquistadors, battle-hardened warriors who had waged Spain's war against Islam for centuries, now found themselves without a fight after Granada's fall. To prevent these seasoned fighters from growing restless, Ferdinand dispatched them to the New World. Their conquest enriched Spain and rewarded the warriors, but left a grim legacy of death in its wake, much of it wrought by European diseases. Whether a Muslim-ruled Iberia would have embarked on such a campaign had Ferdinand failed is a question history will simply never answer. What we do know is that Christianity and European ideals took deep root in the Americas. A Muslim Spain might well have been equally fervent in spreading its faith across the ocean. The presence of a Muslim culture across the Atlantic would indeed have reshaped the world as we know it, casting history in an entirely different light.